we know there are several parts of the brain that are active during the processing of humor. So one part of the brain we would call our organizational analytical brain, which is primarily localized in the prefrontal cortex. So that's the area towards the front of our brains, and it's in part one of the more advanced areas of our brain from an evolutionary perspective. If the humor is has a language component to it, then the language areas of our brains, the lower parts of the frontal cortex and the temporal lobe over here are active in the processing and interpretation of the language. And then there are two other components of brain function that are active in all humor experiments when people look at brain imaging. So one of those areas is underlies what we call the resolution of incongruity. So in a joke, someone starts a joke and they lead you down a path, and then they make a big turn in the path, and that turn is unexpected, and that's what we call incongruity. And there's an area of your brain actually that's very active whenever we ask a human to resolve incongruity or we violate their expectations. Now, the fourth area of the brain that we were the first group to describe this is the reward center of the brain. So the part of the brain that gives you a sense of pleasure. And that part of your brain is tied to your emotional system of your brain, emotion processing in particular. And our group showed that reward center was very active when people looked and found cartoons to be very funny. So we used an MRI machine, magnetic resonance imaging machine, and so if you hurt your head or had terrible headaches, you probably have an MRI, and your doctor prescribed it, you'd have an MRI to try to understand if there is some serious problem going on. So this is the same machine, but it's adapted not to just look at the structure or anatomy of the brain at a single point in time, but you can actually see the brain at work with a functional MRI experience. So the dynamic, real-time activity of the brain. So we had our subjects in the MRI scanner, and we showed them, I think it was 84 cartoons sequentially. Half of them were funny, half of them were not funny, and we had them rate the cartoons in the scanner, and then we looked at how their brain, an individual person's brain, was responding when they themselves thought a cartoon was funny. And personality, how extroverted or introverted you are, for example, seems to have influence on how your brain responds to humor. Men and women seem to have some differences when they are analyzed as one group versus another. Actually, by and large, it's fairly comparable. You're asking who has a better sense of humor? I'm not going to answer that question. That's a dangerous question to answer. I can tell you what our data show. Our experiment shows that actually men and women rated the same number of cartoons as funny. Okay, so there was no difference in how many cartoons each sex thought was funny. Further, when they thought a cartoon was funny, they rated them at the same level. So from their own perspective, from the behavioral perspective, they have equivalent sense of humor. However, from the brain perspective, when we looked at how their brain is processing the information, a lot was the same, but there were some interesting and important differences. So, for example, women tended to use more analytical, language-based parts of their brain to process the information compared to men. And the reward center of their brain was actually more active as well in women. The first we predicted, the second we didn't. It was a surprise. Now we are starting to use functional MRI in children. to determine if, in fact, some of those male-female differences are present at a much younger age. But part of the difference may be how cognitively developed the child is. So at 5 or 6 years of age, you're not going to understand a lot of subtleties or abstraction in the world and so you might just like pranks or sight gags, people tripping, whereas at 10 or 11 you're starting to become more sophisticated and so on. Your language is more sophisticated. So yes, from that standpoint, the type of humor that people will respond to is clearly age-related. I don't know. You should ask one of my colleagues, Salvatore, about this question about whether humor is different in elderly. It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. We have not done the experiments cross-culturally. So after we published our initial papers on humor, I got a lot of emails from people from different countries and different cultures saying, your male, female personality differences don't apply to us, and maybe that's true, maybe that's not. My guess is that different cultures, because of their how they grew up and how people role modeled humor and jokes, that what they find funny is going to be different from culture to some degree. However, humor is, as you mentioned, is pervasive across cultures, and in the end, my guess, I don't know this for sure, but my hypothesis is that the brain systems that underlie humor, particularly the incongruity resolution and the emotion processing reward, are going to be the same across cultures. That's my prediction. It's a lot of fun, and some of my favorite lab meetings in my group, and we actually invited some of my colleagues at Stanford and to bring their students and postdoctoral fellows over, when we were rating the cartoons. So we were trying to determine which were the 100 funniest cartoons out of 500, or some of the best meetings we've ever had. But you know, it's funny, but it's also I got into the humor science area by serendipity, in part because we were asked to study a condition where humor provokes a clinical problem in cataplexy. So humor can provoke this condition, or these attacks, or these cataplectic attacks in people who have narcolepsy generally, where they can lose all control of their muscles and they collapse. And so I was asked to try to design a functional imaging experiment to understand the brain mechanisms underlying cataplectic attacks. So there's definitely some satisfaction to that. And as it turns out, the study of humor is circling back to some of our other interests. So for example, in understanding why some adults and children have more resistance to stress, why they're more resilient. Humor may be part of, or a marker of, that resilience, and that's very interesting to me. And then finally, I guess the part that's very satisfying, it can be funny and it can be satisfying, is I think understanding complex cognitions like humor can help us understand differences across cultures, across sex, across developmental age. And that to me is potentially very, very satisfying, because I think as we understand more about ourselves and the differences among us, we'll be able to be perhaps a little bit more tolerant of one another.